This is lecture 53C in the ABCs of Communism series, which will be Bolshevism 2018, Volume 3. When it comes out next January, that's going to be the third volume in this series, and you have two already in the 2017 series. Next year we'll have three, which will be Communism in East Asia will be the third one. Now, as you'll recall, in our first lecture we went from primitive communism in Japan up and through the Tokugawa, I keep wanting to say Tokugawa shogunate in AD 1600. Then in the next lecture, the last one, we went through the Meiji Capitalist Revolution, named after Emperor Meiji, but it was the capitalist class that emerged and overthrew the shogunate, what was left of the feudal period, and went through the capitalist stage. And now we're going to go through proletarian emergence in Japan, that is the proletarianization of Japan, and the emergence of the Communist Party there. Now, just to recall, you know that Meiji Japan had the policy of adopting foreign technology, and this did not include attracting foreign direct investment. Although if done discreetly, there were wise foreign finance capitalists who did and were attracted to special investment funds with bankers like Shibusawa. Now, Shibusawa, the banker, had a policy list, and that included, first of all, the temporary hiring of foreign specialists, secondly, nurturing of Japanese specialists through study and training abroad at engineering schools and universities, and on-site at state-owned factories. And they mean state, too, there. These were all militarily owned factories. In the initial government investment was in munitions plants, railways, mining, shipbuilding, and agriculture, and that was heavily encouraged. And then finally, fourth, there was an eventual transfer of state-owned enterprises, by which they mean government-owned enterprises, in the areas listed above, to the private sector. And finally, there was the establishment of indigenous Japanese zaibatsu, which is a corporation, by assisting what are called seisho, that's your influential businessmen, and the weeding out of these foreign interests. And finally, there was an encouraging of invention and domestic production through industrial expositions. Now, in 1878, Japan's government-owned enterprises, or GOEs, had limited commercial experience. The generally held opinion was that they contributed little toward replacing imports. On the other hand, what could one have expected? The Meiji government's leadership was committed to making the GOEs the raw material skeleton for modernization by improving their performance, and initially this was to be done by the employment of foreign specialists and the latest machinery being imported. Now, secondly, this goal was to be accomplished by using foreign training of Japanese technical specialists. And finally, the government-owned enterprises would have established the groundwork for the rapid growth of private capitalist industry. The costs for these cap startups were absorbed by the public budget. Now, public works, with the exception of the munitions plants, were to be sold off to the private cap families as soon as possible. The government thereby was footing the financing costs of the great Japanese family's capital stock. The process of privatization directly benefited only these seisho, these important businessmen, who paid almost nothing for the factories in comparison with the capital that had been invested in them. On the other hand, indirectly, the Japanese nation benefited by emerging as a world capitalist national power, and in the minds of the ruling oligarchy of families, what was good for them was by definition what was good for the country, or to hell with the country. A large number of these government-owned businesses had been in the red. Many of them needed large amounts of fresh investment to survive. Japanese business families who took on these loss-making businesses and successfully turned them around performed a great service for the nation, as well as being richly rewarded themselves. And in addition, the role of the government, which took on the risk of modernization and bore its initial costs through establishing state-owned enterprises, was critical. The government-owned enterprise strategy of the Meiji regime was a success. Now, turning our attention to technology transfer, this was achieved in three steps. First, the employment of foreign specialists was one such way. Secondly, by the time the cost of employing these professionals became too high, their replacement with Japanese would happen because a sufficient number cadre of Japanese equivalents would have been trained by that time, and these sequential events dovetailed in such a way as to bear fruit by AD 1900. Then the number of costly foreign nationals employed dropped dramatically. In terms of training, studying abroad at that time meant attending the best universities in the USA and Europe to learn about the latest technologies. Then these graduates replaced the foreign specialists on their return to Japan. At the newly formed university in Tokyo, teaching materials had been foreign. Lectures had been conducted in either German or English, and all this changed as quickly as the newly returning graduates became professors in their own right, wrote their own textbooks, and of course gave their lectures in their own language. And then there was imitation. The importing and imitation of machinery allowed Japanese engineers to demonstrate their capacity for adapting technology appropriate for their country. And as they did, they evolved the inherent ability to maintain and improve that technology. When it was time to introduce a telephone service, Saitoro Oi of the Ministry of Communications and his fellow graduates from Tokyo University collected publicly available information. Then they conducted research themselves in the Western countries, and these same persons undertook negotiations with telephone makers, and they decided on which system to adopt. After 1905, that is, after the Japanese victory in the war against Russia in 1904, Japan had crash programs into major machinery production. These programs featured joint collaboration between domestic and foreign businesses. Accordingly, Japan quickly adapted new technology. From the elite bureaucratic classes came the students who avidly studied engineering. These human resources were placed by the regime into every branch of industry. New industries such as the railways and the telegraph and wire communications had to be accepted as is, and then adapted to Japanese conditions. Examples, I list some of them, I'll mention a few here. Japan Steel Manufacturing was a warship outfitter at a joint venture of the Mitsui Group and the British firms of Armstrong and Company and Vickers and Company. Nippon Electric Company in telephones was established with the technical assistance of Gringolandia's Western Electric. The U.S. firm General Electric assisted Tokyo Electric Company in light bulbs, and Shibaro Manufactures, Toshiba, in heavy electrical machinery got its technical assistance from General Electric. In terms of continuity and evolution along the way, craftsmen and artisans from the feudal period did not disappear with the introduction of Western technology. Traditional production crafts like construction, sake making and brewing, printing, and the making of hand tools and instruments survived and thrived. Naturally, they all evolved, and this sometimes meant merging with Western technology. Sometimes that evolution featured modern equipment that had been introduced on a small scale. Thriving sometimes meant finding a niche market. An excellent archetype of this parallel development is the cotton industry, the star industry of Meiji Japan, and we discussed that extensively last time. In the study of Japan's road to modern communism, the cotton industry is the best model Japan's transformation to true capitalism featured. It was the creation of capitalism's own grave diggers, the creation of an industrial proletariat consisting of both sexes in the cotton industry. The modern spinning mills had hundreds of young female workers standing in rows, operating cutting-edge machinery. This was a completely different workplace than had been traditional. Feudal stage cotton goods production featured the putting out system of small-scale household production coordinated by a broker. With the Meiji Revolution, this coexisted for a long time in parallel with the automation of the mills. In automated mills, the machinery was devoted entirely to spinning. Traditional production, for the most part, took on the task of weaving. Then capitalist modern factories wove cloth from domestically produced yarn as Japan entered the 20th century. Now, the rudiments were there for the true commoditization of labor power, and the Russo-Japanese War did for Japan what the U.S. Civil War had done for North America. With the Russo-Japanese War, powered looms were brought into production, and the mechanization of the textile industry was complete. Japanese and capitalism had simultaneously, therefore, produced its own grave diggers. Japan's heavy and light industrial revolutions were more than processes where traditional and new technologies worked together and complemented each other. One can see the universality of Karl Marx, that is, analyses of how the technological half of the mode of production created the necessary social organizational half. Now all that remained was to give this new class of proletarians their own ideology, to make them self-aware. So, in summation, in addition to the policy of technology absorption, macroeconomic management has also strongly affected the up and downs vicissitudes of the private sector. The monetary and financial systems of early Meiji were in turmoil. In 1877, the reckless printing of questionable fiat to cover the cost of quelling the Satsuma Rebellion caused inflation, and this inflation enriched farmers but impoverished the samurai class, whose rice salaries had already been changed into the one-time receipt of government bonds with fixed value. After 1880, monetary confusion came under control by the central printing of fiat currency as part of the financial policy adopted by the finance minister Masayoshi Matsukata. In 1881, Shigenobu Okuma and his faction that advocated money printing without concern for gold backing were removed from the government, and Matsukata assumed full control of finance. The government then pursued a policy of tight money and fiscal austerity. Price deflation followed, and burgers reduced investment, plunging Japan into recession. The price of rice fell especially hard. Now I come to a section I call New Perspectives in Economics. When viewed from the perspective of long-term industrial development, the Matsukata administration was significant in four ways. First, the deflation policy caused the farmer class to fracture into landless farmers and absentee farmers, or landlords. This ended the unity of the farming classes and thus the political power of what they had called their civil rights movement. Secondly, Matsukata built the financial foundation for industrial growth by establishing the Bank of Japan as the sole authority to issue money, and he created a fiat currency with real value. Thirdly, the Matsukata regime had created a class of landless farmers and thus created a proletariat. At least the loss of land had forced the poor farmers into a potential class available for factory employment. And fourth, a banker class had been created from the wealthy families, and that banker unity provided the financial sharks the monetary capital upon which they built the economic basis of fascism in capitalist Japan. Now, in 1886, accordingly, the Japanese economy entered the company boom period. It released the greed of the young private sector, and the country rushed into an unprecedented boom of setting up joint stock companies. Railway construction and textile production occupied the core of this activity. Moreover, the government underpinned the boom by providing would-be capitalists easy money and permitting the yen to depreciate in foreign exchange. The end of the road came in after 1895 in a succession of waves to establish stock companies again surging. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, fueled this growth, as these wars were the source of great profits for capitalism. Then the ruling class oligarchy saw to it that the central and local governments adopted their policy of post-war management. This slogan meant fiscal spending for military buildup, railways, telecoms, steel production, waterworks, road building, education, and the administration of Taiwan, which was Japan's newly acquired colony from China. The small Meiji government was ordered into transformation to become a big government. Concomitant was the widening of the balance of payments deficit, a reduction in gold reserves, an increase in the outstanding balance of government bonds, and the external borrowing of local governments, and of course policy disputes on the implementation of this transformation between the fiscal activists of the Minryoku Kyuyo, that is, easing the popular burden faction, was inevitable. The former advocated tax and spending cuts and a free economy persisted from the First Imperial Parliament in 1890 to the eve of the Pacific War in 1904 and formed the biggest economic issue for the whole of pre-war Japan. Akira Hara, an economic historian, has summarized the industrialization of the Meiji period as follows. The Industrial Revolution that started with the Kigyo-Boko period progressed rapidly during the Sino and Russo-Japan Wars and was almost over by the end of the Russian conflict of 1904-1905. Cotton spinning, the silk industry, and textile production alike developed rapidly, while shipbuilding and machinery production and the steel industry on which they were based also formed a foundation for future progress. The coal mining industry secured a source of energy, while the silk industry earned the foreign exchange that supported the frail machinery industry, and the munitions plants also became autonomous by relying less on imports. Capitalist Japan was thus complete. Japan became self-aware as a true capitalist power in its own imperialist phase after its victory over Russia. True as it was that Russia was the weakest of the Western imperialist powers, it was still a member of the capitalist stage, and it was in its own imperialist phase. V.I. Lenin had proven that in his book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia. Japan was a nation drunk on its victory against white imperialist Russia, which meant everything the Meiji Revolution had undertaken to accomplish, it had done. It was equivalent to what was to come in 1934 in the USSR's Congress of Victors. Now, let's take a look at the early Japanese communists. In 1910, anarcho-syndicalism was the only left position with the Japanese base. Its best-known spokesman was Kotoku Shusui. He and 26 supporters were arrested and charged with plotting to assassinate the emperor and his family. In the following year, 1911, this group was the prosecutorial target in the Great Treason Trial. Kotoku and companion Kanosuga, along with 11 others, were executed. In 1914, Katayama Sen, leader of the evolutionary pacifist wing of Japanese socialism, fled to the U.S. There he worked with the Socialist Party, taking a special interest in the fight against black oppression, and in the U.S. he founded the League of Japanese Socialists. In 1918, Katayama Sen was won to the Bolshevik banner after the Russian Revolution, and he sent many League members back to Japan to help found the Japanese Communist Party. In November 1921, Katayama Sen went to Moscow, where he was recruited into the Comintern. In 1922, he was placed in charge of the Comintern's penetration of Japan. Katayama's supporters in the U.S. played an important role in the early Japanese communist movement. In May of 1919, the core leadership of the early JCP came originally from the remnant anarcho-syndicalists led by Yamakawa Hitoshi, Sakai Toshihiko, and Arahata Kansen. Not only Katayama's supporters joined them, but also individual student recruits from a burgeoning post-World War I academic Marxist trend. Unsure that these people were anything other than a harmless intellectual university discussion group, they were temporarily tolerated by the secret police. Now we come to Takiji Kobayashi. In 1903, Kobayashi was born in the village of Shimokawazoi in northern Japan, that is on Hokkaido Island. His father was a small landowner. His uncle had lost the family fortune in a failed business venture, and in 1907, Kobayashi and his family moved to Otaro City on the island of Hokkaido. In Otaro, in Otaro City, Kobayashi worked at his uncle's bakery during elementary school, moving on to the middle municipal school. Now, in 1924, Kobayashi graduated from the Otaro Higher School of Commerce. At university, Kobayashi became aware of his family's contradictory class position as former landowners and farmers. Here he decided to become a writer. He chose to identify with oppressed factory workers and farmers. The class struggles, spurred by the Meiji Restoration and the negative effects of capitalist modernization, were the subject matter of Kobayashi's stories as a writer. As we have seen, the 1868 Meiji Restoration had profound implications for Japanese society. In fact, we call it the Meiji Revolution. The government abolished the old feudal caste system, disarmed the samurai, subsidized industrial development, and made landlords dependent on the government. Manufacturing output rose dramatically in the years leading up to World War I. Workers moved from agriculture and forestry into small rural factories. Again, as we have reviewed, the rise in factory work brought shocking social change when women were employed along with men in wage work in large numbers for the first time. For women and men, the capitalist wage slavery that had replaced chattel slavery and feudal sharecropping left masses in worse misery than before. Now, Japanese women had advanced in one sense by being employed at all in the cotton, silk, and weaving industries. However, it was an employment that featured severe discrimination and oppression from their male employers. Factory work meant long hours and low wages for both men and women, and although the city saw economic growth and the spread of wage work, the countryside remained marred by high levels of unemployment and deep poverty. In the 2 years following Japan's 1904 victory over Russia, strikes erupted, shipyards and mines everywhere were struck. Japanese workers had no choice but to improve their working conditions, and early worker struggles had taken place in the mines in the 1870s and 1880s, and rickshawen and printers had formed unions in 1883 and 1884. Now, unionization was targeted for severe government attack, and toothless labor laws were propagandized to fool the world. Unions like the rickshawmen's were routinely destroyed by thuggery. Now, Meiji Japanese society had always been extremely undemocratic. The Diet, which is what the country called its parliamentary body, was elected by only 2% of the population, served the interests of the wealthy classes only, of course, and universal male suffrage was not instituted until 1925, and women did not gain the right to vote until 1945 with the U.S. occupation. George Dimitrov would later define fascism as the raising of violence against workers as the chief diagnostic of fascism as a form of capitalism, and Japan in 1905 already qualified in that regard. In 1904, the first Japanese translation of the Communist Manifesto appeared, and 3 years later, in 1907, Karl Marx Capital Volume 1 sold 300,000 copies on its first release in Tokyo. Now, I'm just going to mention one more thing about the Kobayashis. Back in 1969, when I took a group of students with me to the Stikine River in northern British Columbia, we excavated a site there that an old Indian named John E. Carley had taken us to, and we found a in situ toolkit that was exactly the same as what the Kobayashis had excavated on Hokkaido Island. I didn't know that at the time, but as soon as I got back to Calgary and I read an article by the scion of this Kobayashi family who had conducted the research, I realized, and I went back and looked at all the material we brought in, and sure enough, we had every piece of that Ice Mountain, I called it, microblade and core industry right there. So I feel a kind of an additional contact with this Kobayashi family of communists from northern Japan. And that's just an aside I thought you might be interested in. And if you are interested in those artifacts, you can look at my textbook, Foundations of Archaeology, or the summary of my thesis was published in a journal. My doctoral dissertation was published in the Journal of Field Archaeology in that year, 19, whatever it was. At any rate, now we will move on to the Katayama Sen, who in 1914 was then a leader of the anti-war wing of Japanese socialism, and he departed for the U.S. He had previously spent time in the United States, and in Gringolandia he worked with the left wing of the Socialist Party, took a special interest in the fight against black oppression, and eventually founded the League of Japanese Socialists. In May of 1919, others of the core leadership of the early JCP came from anarcho-syndicalism, namely Yamakawa Hitoshi, Sakai Toshihiko, and Arahata Kansen, all of whom accepted Bolshevism. They, along with Katayama's supporters, joined the JCP. Now, next in import were individual student recruits from a burgeoning post-World War I academic Marxist trend, and in the meantime, between 1914 and 1921, Japan's output of steel doubled. The production of electrical motors increased in value from 9 million to 34 million yen, Overall industrial production increased 500%. The proportion of the manufacturing labor force engaged in heavy industry, characterized by large-scale factories, increased from 13.6% in 1910 to 24.2% by the end of 1918. In 1920, there was a large, permanently urbanized, industrialized proletariat in Japan that was employed in steel mills, shipyards, chemical factories, auto and truck plants, and a largely female workforce in the textile plants joined this mainly male workforce in heavy industry. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution inspired Japanese labor, and its communist leadership grew in prominence. Marxism and its Bolshevik leaders became the predominant ideology among workers and held a wide appeal for Japanese radicals. The hunger for Marxist literature in Japan coincided with an intense period of organizing and state suppression. Japan attacks Bolshevism at home and abroad. In April 1918, Japan was the first imperialist country to invade the territory of the world's first worker state. Its troops were the last to leave in November 1922. Even then, Japan retained control of Sakhalin Island, agreeing to evacuate its troops from northern Sakhalin only in 1925, when diplomatic relations with Soviet Russia were finally established. Japan occupied southern Sakhalin until the Soviet Red Army expelled its troops at the end of World War II. Now, in 1918, sparked by failing wages and rising food costs, some 10 million people took part in 636 separate revolts. The changes in workforce composition, combined with the inflation that accompanied the World War I industrial expansion, resulted in an upsurge in labor militancy and social unrest, and was capped by the rice riots in 1918. The price of rice doubled from 1917 to 1918, and after the wives of fishermen in Toyama Prefecture raided rice shops in August of 1918, rice riots spread throughout the country. From July through September of 1918, Japan witnessed a wave of riots from rural fishing villages to major industrial centers and the coal fields. These constituted the largest upheaval in Japan of workers since the widest-ranging popular disturbances and unrest that had triggered the 1868 Meiji Revolution. The government sent troops to quell the riots, killing more than 100 protesters. In 1919, following World War I, Marxist works were translated and published at a feverish pace, and a surge of unrest led to a mass movement for universal suffrage. The poll tax was decreased, and that increased the voter rolls from 1 million to 3 million. Nevertheless, the government refused to grant universal suffrage. Strikes and labor unrest also spread, and Japanese socialists began warring from within some major Japanese unions. In 1920 and 1921, major strikes were crushed by the army. Students inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution began building organizational ties with factory workers and peasants. Raising the Bolshevik banner, Katayama-sen sent many League members back to Japan to help found a Japanese Communist Party. These supporters had won in the United States, he had won in the United States, played an important role in the early Japanese Communist movement. He himself went to Moscow in late 1921, playing a major role in the Comintern's dealings with Japan from 1922. While the Russian Bolsheviks made efforts to establish contact with Japanese militants attracted to the Russian Revolution's banner, foreign military intervention and the Civil War, which raged in the Russian Far East, made such contact difficult. From the U.S., Katayama argued for forming the Japanese Communist Party and affiliating with the Comintern, and Yamakawa and Sakai, however, were reticent to establish contact with the Comintern, fearing more attention from the Japanese secret police. So in April 1921, the Comintern sent the Korean communist Yi Chung-rim, who had been a student at Meiji University, back to Tokyo. His task was to convince Yamakawa and Sakai to join with Katayama and establish a preparatory committee for a Japanese Communist Party. And the Korean Comintern agent was successful in this regard. So, in April 1921, the manifesto of the Preparatory Committee of the JCP, the Japanese Communist Party, was authored by Yamakawa, working with Katayama protege Kondo Heiso. The 1921 manifesto makes clear that the early Japanese communists were considered the Meiji Revolution to have laid the basis for a capitalist Japan. In November of 1921, a manifesto and regulations of the Japanese Communist Party was published in a Soviet journal in Irkutsk, in Siberia. From 1920 to 1923, there was also a radical upheaval in the Japanese countryside. 7,115 tenant strikes took place. And on 15th of July, 1922, meetings between Japanese revolutionaries and Comintern functionaries in Bolshevik Russia, as well as in Shanghai, led to the formation of the Japanese Communist Party. In 1922, the government was scared shitless over the newly formed JCP and its growing influence, and the Japanese Communist Party was immediately banned and driven underground. The JCP was the Japanese branch of the Communist International, and the Executive Committee of the Comintern carefully supervised its policies. The JCP's contest with the fascist regime was one-sided. The powerful, centralized Japanese state apparatus operated in a small territory and in a closely knit society. It had at its disposal a vast apparatus of law enforcement and efficient civil and military intelligence services. The pre-war and wartime history of the party is thus a story of organizing, being suppressed, starting over, mass arrests, and imprisonment. The Comintern gave new instructions after each police purge and arranged the arrival of replacements. In 1923, the devastating Tokyo earthquake exacerbated the climate of unrest and uncertainty. The fascist regime was not able to identify and blame individual communists specifically because they were in hiding, so it tried to deflect public anger by arranging pogroms against Korean and Chinese immigrants. In 1924, the JCP resurfaced, operating illegally. The JCP dove into the mass movements in trade union organizing, tenant strikes, and the farmer labor parties. It also opposed imperialist expansion and fostered a rich, vibrant political and cultural life among its members. Comrade Kobayashi, who we discussed earlier, was in the thick of this activity, balancing secret writing and organizing while working at the Hokkaido Colonial Bank. In the late 1920s, he participated in strikes and designed posters, took part in study classes with the farmers and workers, and was involved in election campaigns for the Farmer Labor Party of Hokkaido, which inspired his story Journey to East Kuchan. From 1927 to 1933, the complete collected works of Marx and Engels were published in 27 volumes, and a 10-volume collection of Lenin's selected works were published in Japanese. From 1930 to 1934, agrarian tenant strikes rose to over 19,000. So in a bid to clamp down on popular dissent and labor organizing, the regime introduced the Fascist Enabling Act entitled the Public Security Preservation Law. It held that anyone who has formed an association to alter the system of private property and or who has joined such an association shall be liable to imprisonment with hard labor for 10 years. In March 1928, the police arrested approximately 1,600 suspected communists. Following the arrest, Kobayashi wrote a short story based on the event entitled March 15, 1928, that vividly detailed the arrest and torture of communists and labor activists at the hands of the police. The story was published in late 1928 and sold 8,000 copies before being banned, bringing to Kobayashi's critical acclaim, and also the attention of the police. You can imagine that his days at the Hokkaido Colonial Bank were over. Along the way, while on the run, Kobayashi got a job on a fishing boat and learned of the 1926 mutiny on a crab cannery ship. In 1929, Kobayashi was elected to the Central Committee of the Japanese Proletarian Writers League, where he wrote The Crab Cannery Ship. Kobayashi named several of the Hokkaido Colonial Bank's best customers, linking them to the exploitation of farmers, and naturally he had to go down the rabbit hole to avoid arrest by the secret police, but not quite fast enough because they caught up to him in May and August of 1930. During the latter incarceration, he was tortured by the imperial police but he managed to bribe his way out and disappear for good, at least for that moment. Like the gopher in Caddyshack, Kobayashi surfaced and then hid again, repeatedly. When above ground, he went about boldly lecturing, raising funds, and contributing to the Writers' League and other left journals. Kobayashi wrote prolifically during this period, despite being constantly hounded by the police. In 1931, he wrote the short story Yasuko, which tells the story of two sisters who were drawn into political activism and the labor movement. In 1932, he completed a semi-autobiographical story on his work in the Japanese Communist Party entitled Life of a Party Member. Well, as you can see or imagine, this subterranean life could not last forever. Kobayashi was not a forever living Bugs Bunny. In February 1933, Elmer Fudd, in the form of the Imperial Secret Police, caught up with him, and this time they could not be bought off. Kobayashi was arrested, tortured, and brutally murdered. Then, The Crab Cannery Ship, the novel, is based on the 1926 mutiny on a Japanese fishing ship that Kobayashi had learned of when he was on the run. Now, this novel has no central protagonist. Instead, it centers around the group of nameless, unorganized workers. In the story, the crabbing ship is set fishing close to Soviet territorial waters. The ship is a reflection of the class war that grips Japanese society. Profit-seeking masquerades under sloganeering about the glory of the emperor. The company man on the ship is the real authority on the ship, and he refuses to suspend operations to rescue another ship when it's sending SOSs in distress. When the ship radios that SOS and sinks anyway, the company man consoles the captain, saying that at least the other ship was insured. In instances where their own crewmen are lost at sea, he accepts the loss as the inevitable cost of doing business. In one instance, some lost crewmen do not die but are rescued by a Soviet ship. The rescued workers initially are suspicious of the Soviet crew and communism, but they are befriended by a Chinese communist on board who helps them communicate with the Soviets. They proceed to explain the nature of capitalist exploitation and the need to organize against it. The crew members eventually return to the Japanese crabbing ship, where they convince their fellow workers to go on strike. They say, "The most important thing of all, brothers, is to join forces and keep our power united. Whatever happens, we must never betray a comrade. If we just hang on tightly to that, they'll be easier to crush than worms." Now, the work stoppage in the novel is successful until the Imperial Navy arrives, and again we see that it is the Cap state apparatus that breaks the strike and acts only for the capitalists. The novel ends with the crew vowing to fight on in the face of impossible odds, declaring, "Frankly, there's no sense hoping for some future victory. It's a matter of life or death right now. Let's do it again, one more time." The second strike then begins. And the novel is unfinished because the Japanese secret police caught Kobayashi and murdered him. Although the Empire banned the novel, it was published after World War II. This is when General MacArthur, for a short period of time, once he took command in Tokyo, got all the communists out of prison because they're the only ones he could trust to help him run the new occupation government. And of course they wanted to publish stories like Kobayashi's novel, and he let them do it. It wasn't until the next year in MacArthur's administration that he brought back his own favorite group of Japanese fascist capitalists from Manila, but that's another story we don't need to get into right now. At any rate, Kobayashi's stories illuminate the lives of ordinary workers, peasants, women, and party cadre from a fascinating period of Japanese history characterized by intense class struggle, and Kobayashi's experimental style was applauded universally. Crab Cannery Ship was translated into Russian, English, and German. Now, taking a closer look at the Communist International in Japan. In December 1921, the first delegation from the Japanese communists arrived in Moscow. They came to participate in the first Congress of the Toilers in the Far East. In January and February 1922, that Congress was held, and it included not only communists, but also bourgeois nationalist forces such as the Chinese KMT and a variety of journalists. Bukharin, Zinoviev, and Stalin were appointed by the Russian Political Bureau to be the commission in charge of directing the Congress. Zinoviev, who was also chief of the Comintern, convened the event, Bukharin helped draft and present the resolution on Japan. Now, Stalin met with the Japanese delegation and won over some of the anarcho-syndicalists. Stalin retained his interest in the Far East for the rest of the decade, and it is clear that he worked closely with Bukharin in developing the two-stage revolution theory and pushing it upon the communist parties of the East. Now, Stalin had this extensive background of experience as well as Russian intellectual preparation that characterized the post-1904 period upon which to build the Comintern's secret policy on Japan featured Richard Sorge as its chief agent. The tasks of the Japanese communists, quote-unquote, adopted at the Congress clearly states a proletarian dictatorship, the replacement of the military plutocratic monarchy with the power of the Soviets. That is the goal of the Communist Party, unquote. At the same time, the resolution asserted that, quote, the configuration of class forces in Japan allows us to expect the success of a radical democratic overturn, unquote, and argued that the JCP orient itself accordingly. World War I had led to an expansion of Japan's industrial base, as we just reviewed, and the development of a burgeoning industrial proletariat. Thus, the main report on the national colonial question, delivered by Comrade G. Safarov, proved the premise that the proletariat in most Eastern countries did not have the social weight to play a leading role in a revolutionary upsurge except in Japan. Japan was not only capitalist, but a full-blown imperialist country with an advanced proletariat. Safarov insisted that the Japanese proletariat must ally itself with the nations struggling to liberate themselves from Japanese imperialism, and he called for the absolute political independence of the proletariat from the bourgeois nationalist forces with which they might collaborate. In July 1922, as we have seen, the JCP was founded. This was 6 months after the Congress of the Toilers of the Far East completed its work, and in November 1922, during the Fourth Congress of the Comintern, Bukharin authored a draft program of the Japanese Party. He wrote, Japanese capitalism still demonstrates characteristics of formal feudal relationships. The greater part of the land is today in the hands of semi-feudal big landlords. Remnants of feudal, remnants of feudal relationships are manifested in the structure of the government, which is controlled by a bloc consisting of the commercial and industrial capitalists of the big landlords. The semi-feudal character of state power is clearly shown in the important and leading role of the peers and in the basic features of the Constitution, and under such conditions the opposition to state power emanates not only from the working class, peasants and petty bourgeoisie, but also from the great segment of the liberalistic bourgeoisie who are opposed to the existing government. The JCP program stated, the party of the working class cannot remain indifferent to a struggle against the imperial government, even though such a struggle may be constructed under democratic slogans. The task of the Communist Party is to constantly intensify the general movement, emphasize all slogans, and win the dominant position in the movement during the struggle against the existing government. Only after this first direct task has been fulfilled, and some of the former allies have begun to move to the side of the defeated class and groups, should the Japanese Communist Party strive to advance the revolution, deepen it, and make efforts toward the acquisition of power by Soviets of workers and peasants. Bukharin's draft treats the democratic program it puts forward as a temporary agenda for the Communist Party during the struggle to overthrow the existing government. Bukharin's 1922 draft was greeted with significant opposition in the JCP and was never officially adopted by the party. A May 1923 report by Arahata, written for the third enlarged plenum of the Comintern Executive Committee, held in June 1923, describes that dispute that developed in the JCP over Bukharin's draft, and this report was published in Russian in the journal I mentioned and never published, well, at any rate. The increasingly violent strikes in 1921 and 1922 saw the JCP collaborating with the anarcho-syndicalists in the Sotomai, which was what was the name of the main trade union federation. Sakai, at least, did not want to raise the demand for the abolition of the emperor system, fearing that this would bring down further state repression on the young party. The JCP had a central organ carrying the party's line called Vanguard, Zenai. The young JCP desperately needed education and help in fighting through its differences and forging a political line and cadre committed to implementing it. He got guidance to the degree possible from the Comintern in Moscow. The peculiar nature of Japan's transition from feudalism to capitalism continued to reverberate in a myriad of ways. The government promised to introduce universal male suffrage at the end of 23, but the law was not promulgated until 1925. And then the vote was only granted to males over the age of 25, and at the same time there were more anti-communist steps taken, chief among them being the 1925 Peace Preservation Law, and that law made it illegal to participate in any organization which had the objective of altering the national polity or the form of government or denying the system of private ownership. And a resolution of the Japanese Privy Council clarifies this situation and what was to be done about it. Quote, "Since putting universal suffrage into effect will result in the worsening of dangerous ideas, the government must establish and put into effect laws and regulations for the rigid control of dangerous ideas and must exert itself to prevent evil abuses and practices." The Peace Preservation Law was the legal basis for the vicious suppression of the JCP throughout World War II. And this brings us finally to the subject of Richard Sorge. On 4 October 1895, Richard Sorge was born in the settlement of Sabunchi, a suburb of Baku, in what was then the Baku Governorate of the Russian Empire and is today Azerbaijan. He was the youngest of 9 children of a German mining engineer named Wilhelm Richard Sorge and his Russian wife Nina Semyonovna Kobyaleva. Wilhelm Sorge's contract with the Caucasian Oil Company, that is, Oil Company of the Caucasus, expired a few years later and the family moved back to Berlin. There, their cosmopolitan household was very different from the average bourgeois home. Richard's grandfather, Frederick Adolf Sorge, joined them, and he was an associate of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. In October 1914, Richard Sorge enlisted in the German army, which was shortly after the outbreak of World War I. He was then posted to a field artillery battalion with the 3rd Guards Division, and he served on the Western Front. In March of 1916, Richard was seriously wounded when shrapnel cut off 3 of his fingers and broke both of his legs. Before being medically discharged as a convalescent, Richard had been promoted to the rank of corporal and had received the Iron Cross. During his war wounds convalescence, Richard read Karl Marx Capital Volume 1 and the Civil War in France, perhaps not for the first time, but the first time he seriously studied it. He became a communist. He spent the rest of the war studying economics at the universities of Berlin, Kiel, and Hamburg. In August 1919, Sorge received his doctorate in political science from Hamburg University, and he also joined the Communist Party of Germany in 1919. For this, the Social Democrat government fired him from university teaching and barred him from manual employment. You will recall that the renegade Kautsky, Bernstein, and other traitor Social Democrats had replaced the Kaiser's regime with their own Kapp government. The brave Kaiser had fled his country in the face of communist uprisings in the Army, Navy, and working-class districts, and these right-wing nutball socialists had taken power. In 1920, Richard moved on to the Soviet Union, where Otto Kusanen introduced him to Vlad Molotov, who brought him to Joseph Stalin. Lenin was very much the boss, and he had made Stalin chief not only of the Russian Communist Party's intelligence division and that of the Soviet Republic, but also chief of the Comintern's secret department. Stalin made Sorge an agent for that secret department. In short, Otto Kusanen, Vyacheslav Molotov, and Joseph Stalin recruited Sorge as an agent for Soviet intelligence. In Volume 1 of this 3-volume ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018 series, we discussed how Stalin personally oversaw Sorge's indoctrination and subsequent insertion into the Nazi SS intelligence service. For the Nazis, he often used the cover he had established under Stalin's guidance as a journalist when he had been sent to various European countries. Now, from 1920 to 1922, Sorge lived in Solingen, in present-day North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany. Despite his limp, or perhaps because of it, along with his good looks and promiscuous lifestyle, many women considered Sorge as very desirable. especially women of the adventurous type. In Solingen, Christiane Gerlach joined him, leaving her husband. Her husband had been Dr. Kurt Albert Gerlach, a wealthy communist and professor of political science in Kiel. Sorge and Christiane married in May of 1921. In 1922, the Sorges were relocated to Frankfurt. There, Richard gathered intelligence about the business community for Stalin. In the summer of 1923, he took part in the first Marxist Work Week conference in Ilmenau. Sorge continued his work as a journalist, helping to organize the library of the Institute for Social Research, a new Marxist think tank in Frankfurt. In 1924, Richard and Christiane moved to Moscow, where he officially joined the International Liaison Department of the Comintern, which was the cover name for the OGPU Secret Department intelligence gathering body. Apparently, Sorge's dedication to duty led to his divorce. In 1929, Sorge became part of the Red Army's 4th Department, which became the GRU, or Military Intelligence Service. He remained with the GRU for the rest of his life. His control was taken early on by Joseph Stalin personally, who was always thinking way ahead of the enemy. And Stalin had in mind inserting Sorge into the German embassy in Tokyo to liaise with the Japanese Army High Command. The USSR's eastern frontiers were a constant source of concern for the Bolshevik High Command. In February 1929, Sorge went to the United Kingdom to study the labor movement there, the status of the Communist Party of Great Britain, and the country's political and economic conditions. He was then instructed to remain undercover and stay out of politics. The longer time was to use this experience as a basis for making the SS want to recruit him into their intelligence service. In November 1929, Stalin instructed the GRU to send Richard Sorge to Germany to infiltrate formally the Nazi Party's SS intelligence service. The GRU arranged his cover in the form of a job with the agricultural newspaper Deutsche Getreidezeitung. During this critical year, the SS approached Sorge and recruited him into their SD service. Sorge's startup network. In 1930, Sorge arranged for the SS to send him to Shanghai. The SS arranged his cover as the editor of a German news service and for the Frankfurt Zeitung. In 1931, in China, the GRU put him in contact with the agents they had already recruited in the days when the Red Army was in China in force. Included was another Red Army recruited agent, Max Clausen. Sorge also worked with other Red Army recruited agents, including the German Ursula Kuczynski and the North American journalist Agnes Smedley. Smedley, a well-known left-wing journalist, he officially met while working for the Frankfurter Zeitung. She introduced Sorge to Hatsumi Ozaki of the Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun. Sorge recruited Ozaki, who would become one of his most important agents. In China, he also met and had a steamy romance with the femme fatale Hanako Ishii. As a journalist, Sorge established himself as an expert on Chinese agriculture. In this role, he traveled around the country contacting members of the Chinese Party. In January 1932, Sorge reported on fighting between the Chinese and Japanese troops in the streets of Shanghai. In December of 1932, he was recalled to Moscow for a personal instruction from Comrade Stalin on how to get the SD to send him to Tokyo. In Moscow, he wrote a book about Chinese agriculture, and he also married Ekaterina Maximova, who was codenamed Katia. This red agent was a woman whose cover was that she had met Richard in China, and he had brought her back with him to Russia. In May of 1933, the GRU was informed at its highest level only that Stalin had decided to have Sorge organize an intelligence network in Japan, and he was given the codename Ramsey. He first went to Berlin to renew his SS instructions and obtained from them a new newspaper assignment in Japan as a cover. There he built his Legion. That is, in Berlin, Ramsey infiltrated the Nazi Party, attending so many beer halls with his new acquaintances that he gave up drinking so as not to say anything inappropriate. His abstinence from drinking did not make his Nazi companions suspicious. They chose to see it as an example of his devotion to and absorption in his job. We can imagine that he led them to think that, since as they knew he was a heavy drinker, and this was further proof of his devotion to the cause of the master race. While in Nazi Germany, he received commissions from two newspapers, the Berliner Boursen-Zeitung and the Tägliche Rundschau, to report from Japan. Along the way, he eventually was made a contributor to the Nazi intellectual journal Geopolitik and the Frankfurter Zeitung. In August 1933, Sorge went to Japan, passing through New York, arriving in Yokohama on September 6th. Naturally, he did not contact the underground Japanese Communist Party or the Soviet embassy in Tokyo. Sorge himself appeared to be an ardent Nazi and was welcome at the German embassy. Sorge's intelligence network in Japan included Red Army officer and radio operator Max Clausen. These were Hatsumi Ozaki and two other communist agents, one of which was Branko Vukelic. These agents represented the inner core of his network. Vukelic's cover was a journalist working for the French magazine Vu. Eventually, Sorge picked up a Japanese journalist, Miyagi Yotoku, then employed by the English-language newspaper The Japan Advertiser, and Max Clausen's wife, Anna, acted as the ring's courier. Between 1933 and 1934, Sorge formed a network of informants. His agents had contacts with senior politicians and picked up information on Japanese foreign policy. His agent Ozaki developed a close contact with the Prime Minister, Fumimaro Konoe. Ozaki copied secret documents for Sorge. After 1937, Clausen operated under the cover of his business, M. Clausen Shukai, which was a supplier of blueprint machinery and reproduction services. The business had been set up with Soviet funds and was a commercial success. The targets of Sorge's network were primarily to supply Stalin with information about the unfolding conspiracy of the Anti-Comintern Pact, which was Germany, Italy, Japan, and Spain, and the German-Japanese Pact. In January 1941, through his embassy contacts, he learned of Operation Barbarossa, which was Hitler's code name for the Axis invasion of the USSR, and he eventually gleaned the approximate date of that invasion as June 20th, 1941. That date was given to Sorge by Lieutenant Colonel Erwin Scholl, the deputy military attaché at the German embassy. On June 15, 1941, Sorge perfected his report, sending a secret radio dispatch to Stalin saying that the war will begin on June 22nd. In fact, as we know, the attack came on June 21st. But at any rate, Stalin had great confidence in Sorge, having carefully guided him personally into the SD intelligence service of the SS, and later arranging his posting to Japan. Now Stalin needed to know if the Japs were going to come at him while the Krauts were driving on Moscow. On 14 September 1941, as we have seen in Volume 1 of this textbook, Sorge was able to advise Stalin that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union until Moscow was captured. In the same secret radio communique, Sorge said that the Kwantung Army was 3 times the size of Soviet Far Eastern forces. However, it was just as primitive in armaments as it had been before its August 1939 defeat by the Red Army at Khalkhin Gol. This information made possible the September 1941 transfer of Soviet divisions from the Far East to the Far West. Then they took up position just behind Moscow in front of the Urals. Nevertheless, the Kwantung Army in Manchuria necessitated the Soviet Union's keeping a large number of troops on the eastern frontier and in Mongolia throughout the war. The release of Zhukov's Siberian divisions for the Battle of Moscow caused the Kraut Army to suffer its first defeat in World War II. In the summer of 1942, Sorge reported that Japan would attack the Soviet Union from the east as soon as the German army captured any city on the Volga. The Germans, however, had fallen into Stalin's trap at Moscow and never captured that key Volga city. Meanwhile, in Japan, Sorge's counterpart opponent was a man named Ivar Lisner. Lisner was not from the SD, but was an agent of German military intelligence, Abwehr. Stalin had told Sorge to risk it all, meaning his life, in order to keep him apprised of Nazi plans about Stalingrad. Sorge did as bid, and accordingly, as the war progressed, Sorge was in increasing danger. Sorge's radio messages were ciphered with unbreakable one-time pads. However, just the increasing number of these mystery messages made the Japanese suspect that an intelligence ring was operating in Tokyo. In the meantime, for reasons of SD versus Abwehr jealousy and competition, Sorge was also coming under increasing German scrutiny. In 1941, Lister instructed Joseph Albert Mäßiger, the Gestapo resident at the German embassy in Tokyo, to begin monitoring Sorge and his activities. The Kempeitai, Japanese secret police, intercepted many messages originating physically in Japan and closed in on Ozaki. On 14 November 1941, Ozaki was arrested. On 18 October 1941, Sorge was arrested in Tokyo, and on 19 October 1941, a Jap memo notified German Ambassador Eugene Ott that Sorge had been arrested on suspicion of espionage together with Max Clausen. The German ambassador was surprised and outraged. His initial thought was that this was a case of Japanese espionage hysteria. He thought that Sorge had been instructed, passing secret information on the Japan-U.S. negotiations to the German embassy, and further, on second thought, he assumed the arrest could be due to anti-German elements in the Japanese government. Nonetheless, he informed Japanese authorities that they should investigate the incident fully. Ott would not be convinced of Sorge's guilt until a few months later. Then Japanese authorities announced that Sorge had in fact been indicted as a Soviet agent, and the Kempeitai provided their secret file to the Nazi ambassador. After arrest, Sorge was incarcerated in Sugamo prison. Initially, the Japanese believed that due to his Nazi Party membership and German ties, Sorge was an Abwehr agent. However, the Abwehr denied that he was one of their agents, and under torture, Sorge confessed, but the Soviet Union denied he was a Soviet agent. Richard Sorge was hanged on November 7, 1944, at 10:20 a.m. Tokyo time in Sugamo prison. Hatsumi Ozaki had been hanged earlier in the same day. The Soviet Union did not officially acknowledge Sorge until 1964. His mother, then living in Germany, survived Sorge, and he left his estate to Anna Clausen, the wife of his radio operator. He was buried in the Sugamo prison graveyard, but his remains were relocated to Tama Cemetery in Fuchu, Tokyo. The best biography of Sorge with which I'm familiar is that of Gordon Prang. It is also noteworthy that in his 1981 book, Their Trade is Treachery, Chapman Pincher asserted that Sorge, as a GRU agent, recruited Englishman Roger Hollis in China in the early 1930s. Hollis went on to become Director General of MI5 from 1956 to 1965. Former MI5 investigator Peter Wright, in his 1988 book Spycatcher, proved Hollis was a Soviet agent. We have discussed this before, and I especially devoted space in Volume 1 of my autobiography about my experiences via V. Hollis in London in June of 1961. The 2003 Japanese film Spy Sorge, directed by Masahiro Shinoda, details his exploits in Shanghai and Japan, and in that movie is portrayed by Scottish actor Ian Glenn. And that brings us to the conclusion of this particular lecture. We will talk about Japan in the post-1945 period more in December, after we've had this full year of 2017, to see exactly how the Abe regime plays out via the Soviet Union, Russia and China. So for the moment, we're going to move on in the next lecture to Siberia.